What is going on, everyone? Welcome into the next episode of my deep dive series where we are breaking down all 32 teams leading up to the number one team in my power rankings. Today, we reveal the New York Jets coming in at the number 7 spot in those rankings. This is a team that needs no explanation as far as how big their expectations are this year. Anybody that's turned on NFL Network or ESPN in the last 3 months realizes that this was a great team last year, or at least a good team, despite some of the worst quarterback play in the league. And they bring in Aaron Rodgers to hopefully take that step to being a Super Bowl team. Pretty straightforward, right? Really looking forward to this one, though. It's going to be a fun one. And without further ado, let's get into it. Please do hit that like button before we do get started. It really helps me out. And make sure you subscribe if you enjoy. But let's start, as always, by taking a look at this team's exciting offseason, going position by position, where they improved, stayed neutral, or got worse. And let's start with the coaching, and I'm going to have this as neutral. Mike LaFleur is leaving as offensive coordinator, and I don't think he did an amazing job necessarily, but also signing Nathaniel Hackett as offensive coordinator opens up some questions in his own right with what we saw in Denver last year. So going to leave that one as neutral. We'll talk more about Hackett when we get to the coaching segment. But then obviously at quarterback, massively upgraded. Probably the biggest individual upgrade any team made this offseason was getting Aaron Rodgers to be their quarterback. So don't need to explain that one. They say goodbye to Mike White and Joe Flacco that started about half their games last year. And then running back, obviously upgraded as well. All they're losing is Ty Johnson, who played a measly 15% of their snaps last year. And they get Breece Hall back, who only played 20% of their snaps last year, by the way. But they also add Dalvin Cook and Izzy Abanikanda in the 5th round. So pretty clear upgrades in that running back room. At tight end, staying neutral, really running it back with that group with the addition of a 7th round flyer on Zach Kuntz, who we don't expect to see much of this year. Then you look at wide receiver, and this probably would have been upgraded before the recent news of Corey Davis's early retirement from the NFL. Now I see this as slightly downgraded, though I still think this group is going to be more than enough, as we'll talk about later. But they trade away Elijah Moore for a 2nd round pick to the Browns. Corey Davis retires. Also, Braxton Berrios, a solid slot wide receiver that we just talked about with the Dolphins, and they ship off Denzel Mims to Detroit. So 4 guys leaving, and then 3 guys in, 2 of which former Packers, Alan Lazard, Randall Cobb. The joke of this team being the New York Packers stems largely from those 2 signings, I think, and those guys' familiarity with Aaron Rodgers. But then Mecole Hardman as well. This team quietly kind of snuck under the radar and grabbed him, who I think is going to come much more to the forefront now with Corey Davis's retirement. So their losses aren't like crazy substantial losses or anything, but I think you could say the same about their additions. I have it as a slightly downgraded wide receiver room from what they had last year. And then on the offensive line, I have it as slightly upgraded. Not to say there aren't questions with the offensive line, but they say goodbye to George Fant and Nate Herbig, who made up about 1 full starting offensive lineman's worth of players between their snaps last year. And they played okay, but their additions list is pretty hefty. They get Elijah Vera Tucker back healthy, who got hurt early season last year. As of now, it seems they're going to get Mekhi Becton back healthy, their former 1st round pick at tackle. They also sign a swing tackle in Billy Turner, who alone is pretty close to a push with someone like George Fant. They draft Joe Tipman early in the draft in the 2nd round, an interior offensive lineman out of Wisconsin, and they sign Wes Schweitzer, who's been busy starting games for the Commanders in recent years. So there's going to be a lot of talk about this offensive line being one of the major questions for this team, but they do throw a lot of resources at this group. They're just going to have to figure it out, as we'll talk about later. And then you switch to the defensive side of the ball. Really not a ton of movement going on. This defense was so sensational last year. They didn't want to shake things up too much, rightfully so. But with the interior defensive line, they do say goodbye to both Nathan Shepard and Sheldon Rankins, and then bring in the veteran nose tackle Al Woods and Quentin Jefferson. So again, nothing I'm horribly worried about there. Slightly downgraded though. I think Rankins played really well as a 3-down DT2 for them last year, and is at least a notable loss as he heads to Houston, I think it was. And then you look at the edge. I have this as slightly upgraded, even though they lost nobody and spent a first-round pick on Will McDonald. It was already such a deep edge group. I just don't know quite how much Will McDonald's going to play this year, but still a slight upgrade because it's more talent in that room. You go to linebacker, I have this as neutral. Quan Alexander is leaving, but they're really filling in a bunch of options next to him, and Quan wasn't a full-time starter for them anyway. Zaire Barnes in the 6th round, Nick Vigil, Sam Iguavin, Chaz Surratt. Not too much going on with that linebacker room of note. Cornerback, likewise, retaining their starters. Nobody lost there, and really all they added was Jarrett Bernard Converse, a 6th round pick out of LSU. And then at safety, this one was a little bit harder for me to say if it was upgraded, downgraded, or neutral. I'm just going to have to be determined on this one. You know, they did sign Chuck Clark or traded for Chuck Clark, and he gets hurt for the year, not listed there. But they're saying goodbye to LaMarcus Joyner, who played okay for them last year, and they bring in Adrian Amos, who, if he can be what he used to be, this is a clear upgrade. But if he's what he was last year for Green Bay, that's probably a downgrade. So tough to say necessarily. Regardless, safety number 2 is going to be a fascinating conversation that we'll get to later in the video. And then kicker punter, I've got this as neutral. They're swapping Brandon Mann for Thomas Morstead. So mostly just, retaining their key players with some swapping of depth and role players, and then dropping Aaron Rodgers in on top of what was already a good team. So definitely a massive plus there for the offseason as a whole, just getting Aaron Rodgers alone. But before we talk about the roster at large, I want to talk more about the coaching staff here, how they stack up against the rest of the league, starting with Robert Saleh, the head coach. And Saleh impressed me last year. I was a little bit 1 foot in, 1 foot out on him based on what we saw from him in his first season. And even to start the year last year, it was like, okay, when is this defense going to show signs that they can kind of inherit that badass mentality that Robert Saleh brings to the table? And then by around week 4, week 5, it really took over into the defense, and they started kicking ass, taking names on that side of the ball, and they really didn't look back the rest of the year, to the point that now I feel very good about Robert Saleh and what he brings to the table as a defensive head coach. I've got the Jets ranked in tier 2 of defensive coaching, which is top 13 in the league, and then that overall coach and culture grade, which acts as that sort of benefit of the doubt slider. The Jets are still the Jets and have a lot of work to do before we view them as a great culture, but I still think things are in a good place there. I have them in tier 3 for overall coaching culture, which is kind of mid of the league there. But as far as what Saleh does schematically, and of course with defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, who needs his credit as well for the heavy lifting that he does with this defense, I think Ulbrich should be very high on people's list in terms of if you do want to go the defensive head coach route, which, as I've said in the past, has its limitations. Ulbrich should be pretty high on your list at this point as a head coach candidate. But as far as what Robert Saleh's scheme looks like here it's kind of this new coaching tree, is this sort of deviation of the old Seattle cover 3 staff. Both Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich were in Seattle when the Legion of Boom was kind of first implemented under Gus Bradley and Dan Quinn and Pete Carroll, obviously. But Robert Saleh has kind of deviated from that sort of true Seattle 3 scheme in a way that, say, Gus Bradley, who's still with the Colts, hasn't. And it's not to say the Jets won't run cover 3. That's still the most popular coverage in the league in general. But the Jets were towards the bottom 10 in terms of how often they called cover 3. And in fact, they were much more of a quarters heavy team and a quarter half team. They actually led the league in the percentage of their coverage calls that were quarters at 26%, and another 14% were those kind of cover six, quarter, half calls. So that's 40% of their coverage calls were sort of in that Fangio mold of the more off-zone, pattern matching, two-shell style split safety defense. And we did see that from Saleh in San Francisco kind of start to become more popular. And then D'Amico Ryans continued to do that when Saleh left. And it's worked really well for both Saleh and D'Amico Ryans. But the main difference between Saleh's scheme in general from a more Fangio style scheme is, number one, they're a four-man front, which I'll talk about how they use their front in a second. But on top of that, it does feel like Saleh and D'Amico Ryans are just better defensive coordinators than a lot of the Fangio disciples, guys like Joe Barry and Ed Donatel, in terms of like, okay, we'll run a lot of quarters. We understand the value of running off-zone pattern matching coverages. But at times, we're going to have to play physical press man coverage. At times, we're going to have to blitz. And at times, we're going to have to get away from quarters in certain matchups. And they still understand the whole defensive coaching thing in terms of game planning and preparing for specific opponents. And Saleh, I think, proved that he can do that last year. But I also want to talk a little bit about how both Saleh and D'Amico Ryans and this tree with Ulbrich underneath him, how they kind of use their fronts. And I got to shout out my guy Robert Mays of The Athletic, and he used this term to describe one of those Niners defenses under Ryans, but I feel the same way about this Jets defense. He described facing the Niners front and how this Jets front would be as running into a hurricane every single play, and that's so accurate. They don't use their front four like most teams do. It's a ridiculous amount of slants and stunts and just schemes up front, to the point that you never know which direction they're going to come from. It leads to a ton of unblocked defenders, and it also somehow works in this magical way to fill every gap against the run, which you would think if you're getting super aggressive, you would be getting gashed all the time. But they just understand run fits at a next level, and they get super creative in terms of moving guys around and being disruptive at the line of scrimmage. And it's really a thing of beauty to watch both the Jets and the Niners operate at the line. They do it in a way that you just don't see around the league. And it felt like Saleh finally got really comfortable doing that himself last year, now ripped away from, really you can point to the D-line coach in San Francisco, Chris Kachurik, who gets a lot of should get a lot of credit for that. But yeah, anyway, they're in very good hands defensively, again, ranking in tier 2 for defensive coaching. But in terms of the offensive coaching, I think you can make a case that this is the largest question mark for this team as a whole. You know, and I like Nathaniel Hackett. I thought he was well qualified heading to Denver after really working with Blake Bortles at a pretty good level in Jacksonville, going to Green Bay, having the success they had there. He's a coach's son. Paul Hackett was someone that spent time with Kyle Shanahan, and Nate Hackett started with John Gruden back in 2006. So like, he's been around. I felt like he deserved his crack as a head coach, but it really couldn't have gone any worse unless his name was Urban Meyer. The scheme looked broken. The offensive line didn't know who to block. The receivers were running into each other. Russ played horrible football under Nathaniel Hackett, and I don't think it's all Hackett's fault with what happened in Denver, but surely some of the blame, if not a large chunk of it, goes his way. So, you know, I'm kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out on this hire. I think you have some hesitations for those reasons we described, but he is back in his comfort zone, working with Aaron Rodgers, who I think is, in part, some of the offensive coaching here, right? He's going to be very hands-on with what's being called here, and that could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. I think it's more of a good thing than a bad thing, but it's just going to be very wait and see with what we get from the coaching offensively for the New York Jets. Schematically speaking, it's a Shanahan-style offense. I feel that's pretty well documented at this point. Can certainly expect a lot of wide zone run game, a lot of play action, just as we've seen from Green Bay for the last 3+ years since Matt LaFleur took over. But yeah, I've got the Jets pretty low in terms of offensive coaching rankings. Tier 5 for run game coaching, which is bottom 4 in the league. And then pass game coaching a little bit better. Tier 4, which is 21st to 30th. We shall see. Training camps are here and football season is just around the corner, but at Underdog Fantasy, you don't have to wait until late August or early September to draft your favorite players and compete for huge cash payouts. In fact, Underdog's Best Ball Mania 4 is the biggest fantasy football competition of all time with, wait for it, $15 million in cash winnings. Best Ball is draft, set it, and forget it. No waivers, no trades. Underdog will retroactively give you your best lineup every week, which means no sitting there on Mondays, making your friends act like they care about which players you left on the bench that week. I've loved filling out my Best Ball teams this summer, and I know you will too. And right now, if you sign up using promo code TFG at Underdog Fantasy, not only will you support this channel in a big way, but they will match up to $100 on your first deposit. That's 4 free entries into the Best Ball Mania competition or a season's long worth of entries into daily pick'em contests, which are the best way to enjoy NFL games even more with a shot of winning up to 20 times your entry. So that is a match of up to $100 on your first deposit when you sign up right now at Underdog Fantasy. But now it's time to break down this roster where we are going to rank each position group, how they stack up against the rest of the league. And we are going to start with this quarterback conversation that's going to be a fun one. And, you know, I've been looking forward to this for a couple weeks now because I think a lot of people are just done with Aaron Rodgers. They're tired of the COVID comments, the hearing about his ayahuasca trips, the media slander attacks certainly don't help. That have been happening well before the COVID stuff. They're tired of him not getting another ring in Green Bay. You know, all the jokes about him being a playoff choke artist. It's really the cool thing to do is to cheer against Aaron Rodgers. I'll say that. But I would just say be careful what you wish for, because last year for the back-to-back MVP was no way around it. One of the worst years of his career. But even in the worst year, or one of the worst years of his career, he still played like a top 12 quarterback and was playing in the last game of the regular season with a win-and-in situation to make the playoffs. And nobody wants to hear about excuses for quarterbacks, especially when it comes to Aaron Rodgers. But you look realistically at what happened last year, again, for the back-to-back MVP, and the Packers just did not set up Aaron Rodgers for success. They trade away Devontae Adams, of course, but not even that. They trade away Marquez Valdes-Scantling, their second best wide receiver, which tells you what the state of that receiver room was if Marquez Valdes-Scantling is your second best option. Additionally, the offensive line to start the year was not quite ready as they maybe hoped it would. David Bakhtiari wasn't ready to go for the first few weeks of the season. Elton Jenkins wasn't his old self until about mid-season, and the pass protection was towards the bottom of the league, and the wide receiver play was putrid. They quite easily had, I think the only other team you could argue had worst wide receiver play for the first half of the season last year was the New York Giants. You got to remember, Christian Watson didn't really learn how to play football until the second half of the year last year. But you get into the second half of the year, the pass protection was better, the wide receivers played better, and Rodgers played better, and the team played better, and they went on a run and almost made the playoffs. They were a real football team again. And, oh, by the way, week 4 of the season, Aaron Rodgers broke his thumb on his throwing hand. So for a quarterback that didn't show any physical signs of regression from the 2 seasons before that when he won MVPs, I think it's pretty fair to look at his drop-off in accuracy and say, oh yeah, maybe having a broken thumb on your throwing hand changes some things there. So yeah, he had a down year last year. He played like about the 12th best quarterback in the NFL last year. And honestly, if that's what he plays like again this year, the Jets are still going to be Super Bowl contenders because they had such horrible play last year. But it seems almost inevitable that Aaron Rodgers is going to be better this year than he was last year. And that's before you even get into a little bit of well-thought speculation to the fact that he was a little bit more checked out, I think, with the end of that Green Bay era. I think he was frustrated that they didn't give him the weapons that he needed to work with. He obviously had a difficult relationship with the leadership structure in place in Green Bay. And you see him come to the Jets, and he cuts his hair. He's not making controversial comments. He takes a pay cut to win here. He's going to play in a preseason game this weekend. He was practicing with his receivers in May, which he hasn't done in years past with Green Bay. There is a chip on his shoulder that hasn't been there in at least the last season. And as we know, when Aaron Rodgers has a chip on his shoulder, there's arguably no quarterback in the last decade that you want to bet against less than Aaron Rodgers. So I'm quite optimistic that he's going to play at a top 5 quarterback level. And I don't think that's too crazy to expect from Aaron Rodgers. You know, maybe he's not the world beater that he once was as the best quarterback in the NFL, where he can take a bad team and take them on a deep playoff run as he did in his prime. But I still think you're looking at this point in time the smartest quarterback in the NFL. I don't even know who else you would go with there in terms of ability to recognize coverages and make decisions. With Tom Brady out of the league now, I don't think it's even close with him and anybody else. But I guess maybe Joe Burrow. But you also still have a guy with incredible pocket presence, a great arm still, pretty adequate athleticism. Like, he, again, isn't quite what he used to be, but he can still move. He can still get out of the pocket and make plays that way. So I can't wait, man. I think Aaron Rodgers has a really good chance with the Jets and to prove a lot of people wrong, get that second ring. And I love a lot of the stuff he's doing, too, to kind of improve his image at the end of his career here. Because I think a lot of the stuff that he gets criticized for is justified, but I think it has gone a little bit too far. And I'd like to see him become a more likable character in the NFL again here towards the end. So I rank the Jets 4th in the NFL at quarterback, and you guys will just have to let me know in the comments down below if that's too high, too low, or just right. Now, another take of mine I had back in January before Rodgers was ever a Jet was that one of the sneaky best parts of the Jets going to get Aaron Rodgers is how much this could mean for Zach Wilson. And I think that's aged already very, very well. You know, Wilson was in a bad place. But I can't think of a better overall move here for so many reasons. Number one, this is Zach Wilson's idol, right? Aaron Rodgers. Wilson before the draft was talking about how much he models his game after Aaron Rodgers. But also, for all of the crap Rodgers gets in the media, Aaron Rodgers has quietly been a great mentor. He's on record saying he would never want to be what Brett Favre was for him. He wants to mentor young quarterbacks. He's not afraid of these guys taking his job, and he wants to help these guys along. Jordan Love has said that Rodgers was a great mentor for him. Every backup quarterback that's ever been under him has said how much they appreciated Rodgers' leadership. And we've seen it firsthand now through Hard Knocks just how great of a mentor Aaron Rodgers truly is for a guy like Zach Wilson. He's just taken him under his wing straight up. And I think you're already starting to see not just the on-field play look better for Zach Wilson, where he's getting some of that pocket presence, moxie back that he had at BYU. He's getting through his progressions, making plays with his feet, but also like his confidence coming back a little bit. And you look at the window now, and I know we're spending a lot of time on Zach Wilson, who has not played well to this point in his career, but you look at a maybe 2-year window here with Aaron Rodgers, where Zach Wilson could have 2 years to sit and learn here and then get another kind of clean, fresh opportunity at really like Jordan Love's age, ironically, to take over as a potential franchise quarterback and salvage what was the number 2 overall pick for this Jets team. So it's like a complete win-win going to get Aaron Rodgers. I'm not saying Zach Wilson is for sure going to save his career here, but I loved him as a prospect. I think he's gotten a lot of hate, and a lot of it's justified. He has not played well, but there's a ton of talent there, and I can't wait to see years from now if that all plays out. And hell, maybe even if Rodgers has to go down for a game or two, that could be as early as this year, where he's at least a capable backup that can be a much better version of himself than what he was last year, where we still know this Jets team can win some games with bad quarterback play. But let's talk more about the weaponry that they have to work with here, where they now rank 23rd. The Corey Davis retirement did hurt. I'm not going to lie. I was optimistic for what Corey Davis was going to get to look like here as the number 2 wide receiver with Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball. But he's going to step away and leave us with this group. I will say it's pretty funny how similar this group of weapons is to the last two groups that Aaron Rodgers won an MVP with. You know, you have your number 1 wide receiver who wears number 17. You have Allen Lazard, and you have a deep threat with questionable hands in Mecole Hardman. And then you have a no-name tight end in Tyler Conklin, Randall Cobb chilling as a rotational slot guy, and a pretty good running back room. It's actually insane how similar this group becomes now that Corey Davis is no longer here. And as we know, Aaron Rodgers has shown that he can do plenty of damage with a group like this. And this is a much, much better group heading into the year than what Green Bay had last year. Let's make that very clear. But let's give these guys individually a little bit more time. So Garrett Wilson, there are no breaks for me with how much I think hype is deserved for this combination here with Rodgers and Wilson. I love Garrett Wilson coming out to start. I went as far as saying the Jacksonville Jaguars should consider him with the number 1 overall pick, especially if they're going to take Trayvon Walker. And I think if they could go back in time, you'd maybe do that. He is the complete package of a wide receiver, someone with the potential to be as good as a Stephon Diggs, Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, something like that. His skill set is fairly similar in terms of the foot speed, the long speed, the route running, the hands, the body control. The run after catch is so special with Garrett Wilson. He's so creative and shifty after the catch. In fact, my pro comp for him was Stephon Diggs, because even though he is a little bit more of a slender player, and he's not necessarily the most fast receiver on the field at all times, but he plays above his size. He plays honestly bigger than Allen Lazard does at 6'5", 215 pounds. So I don't remember who it was, but someone was getting criticized for saying that Garrett Wilson is the second most talented wide receiver that Aaron Rodgers has ever played with. And yeah, no shit. I mean, the only other guy in question is Jordy Nelson because of his long speed and body control, but it's not even an argument in my mind. Yes, Garrett Wilson is the second most talented wide receiver Aaron Rodgers has ever had. No, Wilson hasn't proved out to be an elite receiver in his first year with some of the worst quarterback play in the league. But if you put a gun to my head and say, does Garrett Wilson finish the year as a top 5 wide receiver? I would have to say yes. I'd be too scared to say no. So definitely a guy I'm targeting, needless to say, in my fantasy drafts. I think all the first round buzz on him, I think, is totally warranted. And I think especially with like touchdowns, that's where he's really going to thrive. Aaron Rodgers loves feeding touchdowns to his number 1 wide receiver down in the red zone, and I think Wilson's going to be the benefactor of that. Would not be surprised if in fantasy football he finishes as wide receiver 1. So no breaks from me on the Garrett Wilson hype train. Now, the rest of this group, I would have a little bit more skepticism on. You know, Allen Lazard as a wide receiver 2 is certainly less exciting than when he was their theoretical wide receiver 3. I just don't think he can do a lot of the stuff Corey Davis could. And if Garrett Wilson gets hurt, they're in a bad place here. Lazard is fine for what he is. He's a great run blocker. He's a quasi tight end, honestly, in the way that he's going to be used in this offense as a big-bodied slot wide receiver. And that brings value to the run game. And at times, he can make some really nice catches because he's 6'5" and sometimes uses that size to body up defensive backs. But that's where he really frustrates you, is for a player that is not fast, he's not a separator, he's not a good route runner, and for those reasons, a lot of his targets are going to be contested. He's a career 43% contested catch rate guy. 39% last year, was as low as 29% in 2020. So his lows are pretty rough. You know, that 39.1% contested catch rate of all receivers that saw at least 20% of their team's targets last year, Allen Lazard was 68th in the NFL, and he's one of the 5 biggest receivers in the NFL. That's borderline embarrassing. And you pair that with the fact that he has had some of the most gut-wrenching, poorly timed drops in critical moments. Feels like every time he has a drop, and there's a decent amount of them from Lazard, they're on third down. So he has some incredibly frustrating moments. He was ridiculously overpaid. I see Allen Lazard as a Zach Pascal level player who should be getting close to league minimum contracts, but is elevated because of Aaron Rodgers' trust in Lazard. He is a mentally sharp guy. He's going to do the little stuff between the margins that Rodgers loves. But honestly, that might be the biggest criticism of Aaron Rodgers in the last 3 years, is that he's too high on Allen Lazard. And I hope that that doesn't become a backbreaking factor for this Jets offense in the same way that it's held back the Packers offense at times, where I will be honest, you will see Aaron Rodgers missing open reads because he's kind of staring down Allen Lazard, and that was after Devontae left. You're hoping the presence of Garrett Wilson will open things back up in terms of his decision-making in the same way it was much better when he had Devontae Adams. But then you have Mecole Hardman as now the wide receiver 3. And I don't hate this. I think he does bring an element that these other guys don't have, and that is that true deep threat ability. And I think this, in a way, will make things less complex in terms of play calling. He can be the MVS guy that's just going to try to take the top off the defense and keep the defense honest. And I think that will be healthy for the run game, where it'll be a little bit harder to load the box with a deep threat like this on the field and keep those safeties from buzzing down a little bit too much. So, you know, I am excited for Mecole Hardman. I think he's a great best ball draft pick, because I think there will be weeks where he's getting 100 yards and a touchdown on like 3 touches. And he's going to be a guy, too, that should see some action on jet pop passes and jet sweeps and stuff, where, you know, Matt LaFleur has always experimented with that kind of stuff. I expect that to be very similar here with Nathaniel Hackett. So I think he's going to step in and be just fine. But he doesn't bring the consistent wide receiver 2 that I was excited for this offense to have, that Corey Davis was going to be. And I would be a little bit worried about Mecole's ability to kind of have that mind melt that Rodgers looks for with all his wide receivers, in terms of getting the right checks pre-snap and making those subtle adjustments based on the coverage and all that stuff. Rodgers is crazy about that shit, and there is a reason he hasn't worked out with every wide receiver he's ever had. But for what he is, I think he's going to have some good weeks. And then you got his Randall Cobb. You know, that's his brother. Cobb just can't hold up with a full workload. But I'm not going to lie, in the last 2 years when he's been out there, he's played well. So you love having him. And when it is third down and you want more of a true slot wide receiver, you can take Mecole off the field, put Randall Cobb out there. He is going to have that chemistry with Rodgers, and he likewise is going to make some plays. So they certainly have the depth to fill in with adequate wide receiver 3 play. It's just everybody kind of gets pushed up a little bit without Corey Davis here. And then you kind of have an open competition with the rest of these wide receivers. Malik Taylor has gotten some buzz, as well as Jason Brownlee. Taylor's got some size. He's flashed some ability to win on the outside. And then Jason Brownlee is also interesting. I liked his tape out of Southern Miss. I had a 7th round priority grade on him, so I thought he was a draftable prospect for what it's worth. You know, he doesn't have a lot of physical tools in terms of size and speed, but a really instinctive receiver. So if he's making plays in the preseason, that's not a huge surprise. And I would keep my eye on him if they started to deal with some injuries. You know, maybe he could step up and make some plays. Beyond that, the only other guy I'm familiar with is Alex Erickson. has stepped in as a backup slot receiver throughout his career and has been a very consistent punt returner too. So we'll see if he makes the team. But then you get to tight end, and it's a pretty bland group. I know a lot of Jets fans likes Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin is that classic tatted up white dude at tight end that if any team, any fan of a team that has a guy like this, the fans of those teams are going to think he's like, 10 grade points higher than he should be, basically. Like, there is an aesthetic here that people fall in love with, but he's fine for what he is. He actually has pretty good hands, and he's a decent blocker. He's got decent size. Like, I'm not trying to dunk on the guy. He's an adequate possession tight end. And honestly, reminds me a lot of Tom Crabtree with Aaron Rodgers back in the day, like the same exact aesthetic. So maybe there's a little connection there that develops, but he's just not a separator. He's not a matchup problem or anything. And he'll make a couple plays, contested catches and check downs, break a couple tackles after the catch. Like, he'll be fine. And then CJ Uzomah, who kind of lost this job to Tyler Conklin because of the more physical aspects of the position. Uzomah's a really nice athlete at his size, but has never been a super consistent player. But as a tight end, too, he's good depth. You also have Jeremy Ruckert in year 2. Decent prospect out of Ohio State. Don't mind him as a third tight end. And then Zach Kuntz. Got to keep an eye on him, man. It's not even a confirmed fact that he's going to make this team, but I think it'd be a huge risk to let his athletic profile hit the open market. This is quite literally the most athletic tight end prospect on paper to ever come into the NFL. He's 6'7". He's going to be a god in your Madden leagues. But I liked him. I definitely thought he should have been drafted before the 7th round. His tape wasn't as bad as you would expect for a guy that was going to go in the 7th round, So he is raw. He's got a lot to learn, but I hope he makes the team because I think there's room for him to grow with Aaron Rodgers to the point that maybe by the end of next year, he could turn into a starter and a difference maker for them. Kenny Ebo, likewise was an athlete that fell because his tape wasn't all that good. So he's kind of competing for a spot with Zach Kuntz. And then you get the running back room. And, I think Breece Hall is going to figure it out here. He was really good in the receiving game in college and was really productive in the 7 games he had last year. But the drops, 5 drops, dragging down his receiving grade here. But he can run routes. He can line up as a wide receiver. Really good after the catch. As long as he cleans up the drops, he has a chance to be one of the 5 to 10 best receiving backs in the NFL. Just go hit the jugs machine, and you'll have an Aaron Jones-esque weapon there for Aaron Rodgers in the receiving game. Again, it's crazy how similar this room is on so many levels. He is, though, coming off the ACL injury. They don't want a J.K. Dobbins situation where he doesn't get back to 100% in time. So they bring in Dalvin Cook, who you expect to see a decent amount of targets, just as he has in Minnesota. Great screen threat, but he has always left a little bit to be desired in terms of route running and hands. Not to say he's a bad option in the receiving game, but maybe not quite what he could have been throughout his career. Michael Carter as well, super polished in the receiving game. Another really nice option there. Don't even really have to bother the rest of the group there. They have 3 options that are going to be at worst a good option and at best a great option in Breece Hall. So there's your New York Packers group of weapons and quarterback room. But let's talk about those running backs a little bit more in terms of their impact on the run game. And I've got the Jets ranked 9th at running back in the NFL. And it's kind of, I loved the Dalvin Cook signing basically because you have one guy with a huge arrow pointing up and one guy with a huge arrow pointing down, obviously in Dalvin Cook. But what we've seen from Cook is that as seasons go on, he tends to get a little bit banged up, slows down a little bit. But we've seen as well that the explosiveness is still in there when he's healthy. So if they can just get the first 8 weeks of Dalvin Cook healthy, and then they can mix in Breece Hall, and then come playoffs, you could maybe have both these guys full go at 100%. And the fact that you have Dalvin Cook there to play for the first half of the year while Breece Hall nurses that knee, this is just such a perfect game plan for this running back room. And They can't rank in the top 5 because Breece Hall hasn't proven to be a top 5 back yet, but he was starting to look like that true game-breaking running back early in the Jets season, but late in his season before the ACL injury. He was my number 1 running back coming out. He's athletically gifted. He's got size. He reminded me of some hybrid of like David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell coming out. And you started to see that type of player last year. So he's just got to come out and prove it and get healthy, and you feel great about what he's going to be. And then, Dalvin, we know what he is. He's a great wide zone runner, so it's a good scheme fit too. He's got that home run hitting ability. He's got really light feet, great vision. This is quite easily one of, if not the best running back duos in the NFL, and they're going to help the run game quite a bit. You've got depth too. Michael Carter is good for what he is. He lacks size and overall long speed, so it just has held back his upside, but he's been effective when he's played. Zonovan Knight stepped in as an undrafted free agent, ran the ball really hard, really well. He can be an option early in the year if they have to go that deep on the depth chart. And then they spend that day 3 pick on Israel Abanikanda. Definitely a steal where they got him. I thought he was a late day 2, early day 3 talent, a lot of speed. My pro count for him was Raheem Mostert. We're probably not going to see a lot from him this year, especially because I think he just got banged up in the preseason. But he was very much a why not draft pick, and a ton of talent there. Travis Dye was a fascinating prospect for his receiving chops, but he's probably not going to make this team, let's be honest. You're not getting a lot from Rodgers in the QB run multiplier department. He is excellent on play action boots and is going to have to keep your backside end honest. So for a team that runs a lot of wide zone, you get a slight bump there because you usually don't have to worry about blocking that guy. But yeah, you're not getting read options and QB power from Aaron Rodgers at this stage in his career. Let's talk about the offensive line. And this is where a lot of questions lie for this team. I'm certain, I have my questions. I'm less worried about it though than I think the public media is making it out, especially over the last couple of days where this has taken a turn for the better. Dwayne Brown recently came off the PUP list, and Mekhi Becton is now listed as their starting right tackle, which is great news. So hopefully that continues to trend in the right direction, because both those tackle spots are certainly iffy. The interior group is great. I like what they have there. But let's just go from left to right. Back to Dwayne Brown there. He's 38 years old, but when he got that contract extension from the Jets, it was more money than you would expect. They feel pretty solid about his ability to still play at a high level as a quality starting left tackle, and when he's been on the field, he's shown that. Definitely has shown slight regression in the last couple of years, which is only natural at his age, but he's not like a putrid athlete, and he's obviously extremely technically proficient. So he's a good all-around player. Just got to stay healthy and avoid too much regression at his age, right? There's going to be some questions naturally for that. At left guard, you've got Laken Tomlinson. And I know his run block grades took a massive hit last year going from the Niners to the Jets. I do think the run game was a pretty big mess in terms of, their schemes and them kind of being on the same page. It just felt sloppy. And I think that hurt his ability to get clean blocks on tape and get positively graded runs. But you still saw the same Laken Tomlinson when he was able to line up and just block wide zone and flush guys out. And I'm really not worried about his drop-off in PFF run game last year. He was a plus run blocker the 2 years before that and got paid to be that guy. I think he's still there. I think it was just much more of being a part of the disaster that was the run game last year. Pass blocking, he's even got better as his career's gone on. This is a former first-round pick with a lot of athleticism, has figured out how to play, and he's turned into a really good guard. So you're locked in at left guard there with a good balanced player. At center, it does seem like Connor McGovern is going to fend off second-round pick Joe Tippmann for now. when they took Tippmann, I was like, it's a fine pick and all, but I didn't think they necessarily needed it because I liked Connor McGovern's tape last year. I think he's a perfect fit for this blocking scheme. He's a good athlete. He's nasty. He's got that kind of wrestler's strength to get leverage and be a good run blocker. I think he's okay as a pass blocker. Nothing special. It's pretty standard for these centers and these wide zone offenses to be a little bit lighter and quicker and struggle to anchor a little bit in pass protection. So you don't want him left one-on-one necessarily, but if he ends up their weakest link in pass pro, you'll be fine with that. So again, a very good starting center. And then at right guard, you have Elijah Vera Tucker, who, while I get a lot of crap from Jets fans for saying they should have just taken Christian Darrisaw, and Jets fans don't like to hear that, it's not that I don't think Vera Tucker is a very good player in his own right. He's got to get and stay healthy. That's been the biggest issue for him. The main thing that I'm like slightly lower on Vera Tucker, I guess, is I don't think he's a great pass protecting guard at this point in time. It's not to say he can't get there. It's a guy that played tackle in college at times, and he needs to continue to get those reps and clean up his technique and all that. He does have weeks where he suffers a few too many losses. That's just the reality of it. But as a run blocker, you love him. He's the best run blocker they have for sure. Can block any scheme. He's athletic enough to pull. He's got enough play strength to down block if you want to run power. And I think the fact that they're keeping him at guard is very telling because, I think it's kind of like what the decision that the Cowboys have had with Zach Martin and the Colts have had with Quentin Nelson, where it's like they could probably be a pretty solid tackle, but they could be a great guard. And I don't know if Vera Tucker is quite the player those guys are, but I think the thinking there is the same. So we'll see just how high his ceiling is if he can stay healthy and finish a year of development. Then at right tackle, theoretically, it's going to be Mekhi Becton, which, again, is very good news. But for how long is he going to be their right tackle? That's been the question. He didn't play any snaps last year. It's a guy that has not been able to stay healthy since he came into the league, really. It's been about 2 years since we saw him play at all. But he was the 11th overall pick. He has rare athleticism relative to his size. He still has some clunky feet and can have some losses in pass pro. But when he's played, there's been nothing that says he can't be sort of a Trent Brown, Orlando Brown caliber tackle, which would obviously be a great thing here. But just got to get his body right. And that's a literally massive question mark for this team. Because once you get into their depth, they have some options, but it's nothing that you'd feel great about being a starting tackle for Aaron Rodgers. Now, Billy Turner is one of those guys, and Billy Turner was a starting tackle for Aaron Rodgers in, one of his MVP seasons. He was not that player when he went to Denver, unfortunately. Really dropped off. He's getting up there in age, so I don't even know if he's the guy he was in 2021, but he's an option, I guess. But the next guy in is probably going to be Max Mitchell, who's a year 2 player, a 4th-round pick out of UL Lafayette, who I like. And I like his run blocking quite a bit. But the thing is, he just lacks play strength. He's a smaller guy, and it hurts his ability to be consistent. So maybe he can add some muscle over the offseason, or maybe he did. It's a little late at this point. But kind of wait and see there. But I wouldn't feel great about him being a starter. I liked Carter Warren for what he was as a mid-round draft pick, someone with a pretty high floor as a pass protector. He could be a pleasant surprise as a day 3 rookie, but you certainly don't want to count on that. And then your only other option, if Mekhi Becton or Dwayne Brown, right? He's got questions in his own right. If you have to go to depth, the only other option would be to play Elijah Vera Tucker as a tackle, where I think he would be probably better than any of those depth options. And then you could turn to guys like Wes Schweitzer, who's a capable backup veteran, or second-round rookie Joe Tippmann, somewhere on the interior with Vera Tucker sliding to tackle, which in a pinch, I think they just might do that, but they're hoping they don't have to. I will spend just a second on Joe Tippmann. Really athletic, big-bodied center. I didn't have an issue with where he went in the draft necessarily in the second round, but I did have an issue with them taking him over John Michael Schmitz. I just didn't understand that. Reminds me a ton of when the Green Bay Packers took Josh Myers over Creed Humphrey just was like, does not compute in terms of draft analysis. Tippmann could turn into a decent player, but I can't believe they chose him over John Michael Schmitz. I just did not think they were in this close to the same tier as prospects. So hopefully they don't regret that too much, and Tippmann turns into a nice player. But I think Tippmann just has a lot to clean up, really, as a pass blocker, and a lot to prove at the next level as a run blocker too. But that's not to say he doesn't have potential, and that was some egregious pick. But I did want to kind of note at that, get it on the record again, if you will. So the depth's not horrible overall relative to the rest of the league. It's more just like their likelihood of having to go to their depth is higher than most teams in the league, which is scary, and does ding their overall grade. So they come in 22nd in pass protection and 13th in run blocking, 18th for overall offensive line. If you could guarantee me that Becton and Dwayne Brown and all these guys stay healthy the whole year, this could be a top 10 offensive line. There actually is a lot of talent here, but you feel so uncertain that Becton can get through the year that it's scary. So that rounds out the offense as a whole. They come out as my 14th overall offense, which if you could give last year's defense the 14th best offense, they're a world beater. And that's what they're hoping for this year. 9th in passing game, 19th in run game. But the biggest thing you'll notice there is how much the coaching kind of brings this down a little bit. And that makes Nathaniel Hackett actually one of the bigger swing factors for this offense. I think if Hackett can kind of get some of his mojo back and things click a little bit better with Aaron Rodgers, and he actually proves to be a pretty good offensive coordinator, which I'm not going to rule out. Sometimes coaches just do learn from their failures. And other than his results in Denver, I have no reason not to like Nathaniel Hackett. So if he can just be an average coordinator, this should be a top 10 offense, really. And then, of course, the offensive line variance adds some extra questions there. But overall, 14th, very respectable ranking for the offense. Let's talk about this defense, though, which really just doesn't have a lot of question marks, which I think is going to make this a little bit of a faster conversation. But as we start with this defensive line, I'm actually listing 8 starters for this group. I normally list 4, and I was like, who the hell should I list as the first 4? That's an extremely difficult decision, especially with the edge group, not so much the interior guys. But even then, a guy like John Franklin Myers will play a lot of interior for them. So there you go. There's your 8 good Jets defensive linemen there. I mean, this is a crazy deep group. They're right up there with the Eagles in terms of how many guys they can throw at you. But let's start with the edge guys, because there's really 6 of them that are all going to get, I think, a pretty close number of snaps. I think Bryce Huff probably gets the least, but he still deserves snaps. Carl Lawson is their kind of best true edge rusher at this point in time. He still has it. Came off the ACL injury. I think a big part of why they drafted Will McDonald, though, is they know that Carl Lawson's knee is kind of a ticking time bomb. I hate to say it, but it was when they signed him. He got less guaranteed money than he probably should have based on his production at that position. And right away, he tore his ACL. So, if they can get what they got from him last year, you'll love it. But they've set themselves up where they really wouldn't even feel it all that much if they lost Carl Lawson. But he's the most complete package as a rusher. He's got some power. He's got a lot of different pass rush moves that he knows how to go to. He is kind of a coaching clinic in terms of pass rushing technique. I've always loved Carl Lawson. He's got good bend too. He can defend the run when he needs to, but they don't ask him to do that, because why would you do that when you have other guys that can do that and you're just reducing his injury risk? So it's a very natural position for him to be in, where he only needs to play on critical pass rush downs for them, and that can hopefully reduce his injury risk. And then Will McDonald and Bryce Huff are going to those 3 guys right there are kind of in that, let's just say, rotational designated pass rusher role. McDonald and Huff especially are smaller guys and not going to be someone you expect to be great on early downs against the run. Granted, McDonald did play 4-tech for Iowa State's stupid Big 12 style defense, and he actually held up okay there. I don't know how well. I mean, he's 240 pounds, so like you don't expect him to defend the run at the next level. That's not why they drafted him. But with McDonald, he does have really nice pass rushing upside. I think they drafted him a little bit early for my liking. He's already 24 years old and is a little bit riskier because there was a lack of production, but you can pretty much exclusively point to how he was used at Iowa State for that lack of production. You know, when PFF was able to separate his real pass rush snaps off the edge, he had one of the best pass rush win rates in all of college football. He's got crazy bend, great get off. He has pass rush moves on tape, so it's not like he's raw. He just hasn't proven to be a highly productive player. So I wouldn't be stunned if he blows up as sort of a Hassan Reddick level pass rusher for this D-line. My pro comp for him was Harold Landry, and I feel much better about him becoming that kind of player, but you would take Harold Landry in the first round, right? So again, not some egregious overdraft, but I just don't know how much he's going to play, but I really like that he is insurance to a Carl Lawson injury. And then Bryce Huff, again, in this designated pass rusher role, was another reason I was like, you didn't really need Will McDonald. I mean, Bryce Huff, when he got opportunities last year, was one of the most efficient pass rushers in all of football. I still don't understand why the NFL doesn't like him. He did not receive a combine invite. I tweeted at the time how ridiculous that was. I had a 3rd to a 4th round grade on Bryce Huff. He goes undrafted. All he's done for the Jets is prove that he can play. Unfortunately, he's going to be buried pretty deep here, and I just hope eventually he gets a chance to start somewhere, because he would be starting for some defensive lines around the league, or at least be a starting designated pass rusher. So you can kind of throw those 3 guys in that pass rush downs bucket of good pass rushers. And then you have a different bucket on the edge with both Michael Clemens and Jermaine Johnson. These, I would say, are your early down edge guys, because both these guys can defend the run really well, especially Michael Clemens. And he actually, these were both rookies last year. Clemens actually outsnapped and outplayed Jermaine Johnson last year, who was a 1st round pick, because of how incredible he was against the run. Now, Clemens, that was expected. He was great against the run in college. He's up there towards like 270 plus pounds. And he plays with his hair on fire, so they love him for that in the role that they're asking these guys to be. Jermaine Johnson has a little bit more upside to actually turn into more of a 3-down rusher. They don't need him to do that necessarily, but he went in the 1st round for a reason. He's got a great first step. He's got a ton of power. He has a good rip move. And I do think the arrow is pointing up for Jermaine Johnson. It is interesting that, like, he was a Senior Bowl darling. He was kind of a consensus 3rd round guy and then just dominated the Senior Bowl. And then you load up his film and it's like, well, he had 2 or 3 great games in college and then disappeared in other weeks. Was a 24-year-old prospect coming out. So, like, it's not that he was a bad pick in the 1st round, but I was kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out on him as a prospect. And his rookie year was just okay. Like, he was a good rotational player for them. I think he can be that again. But in terms of returning 1st round pick value as an edge rusher, he just has a lot of work to do to kind of earn more snaps here somehow and prove that he can win at a more consistent rate. But yeah, I'm not trying to dunk on him. As your 5th best edge rusher, you're totally fine with a developing good athlete of a 1st round pick. And then you also have to lump John Franklin Myers into the edge group conversation. JFM will also play a lot of early downs, which makes it hard for them to get Jermaine Johnson out there, right? You don't want to take Clemens off against the run. You've got your 3 designated edge rushers that have proven more as rushers than Johnson. And then John Franklin Myers is going to need to start pretty much every snap. So it is just crazy how deep this rotation is. But Franklin Myers was a hybrid end coming into the league, was more of a 3-4 end when he started. Now he's more of a 4-3 end in sort of that kind of the Michael Bennett inspiration with this scheme, where he's going to play 5-tech on early downs. He's going to smash the run, and then he can come inside as a 3-tech or a 4-eye in their wide 9 front. And really, that's where he's probably at his best, is rushing from the interior. So he'll play some D-tackle snaps. He'll play some end snaps. He just eats up a bunch of snaps and is a big reason why they don't have a high-end or at least why they haven't invested a ton in a second defensive tackle, because that's kind of John Franklin Myers. But he's a really underrated player. He was one of those contracts that came in from Schefter that the people really paying attention knew it was going to be a pretty hefty payday for him. But a lot of people were like, John Franklin, who? But well worth it. Really good player. Followed it up again last year. Kind of an unsung hero for this defensive line still. And there's really no need to talk about anybody else. I think they'll keep those 6. I don't expect Tamapau or Deslin Alexandre to make it, but it's obviously a very special edge group. Then you get to the interior defensive line, and Quinnen Williams. We haven't even mentioned him yet. I mean, he's the best player they have on this defensive line. He really reached that upside as that blue chip top 3 pick that he was, and really started to look like that alpha number 1 rusher. You know, like, for example, the Chiefs have never had a great edge rusher in the Chris Jones era, but they've had one of the best pass rushes in the league because they have Chris Jones. And I think Quinnen Williams can certainly prove to be at that level this year. I felt like he really came on in the second half last year. He gets the $95 million payday, well-deserved. $1 million for every number of his jerseys that he's got there, wearing number 95. But I think Quinnen Williams is going to kind of, in a way, break out. Like, I know he already did break out last year, but get up into that sort of top tier defensive tackle conversation, right up there with a guy like Chris Jones. He's that special of a player. He defends the run well too, and his presence in the middle allows them to do a lot of these stunts and, you know, defend the run from a wide 9 and all that stuff. So he's incredible. And then it's going to be a little bit of a rotation with the other defensive tackle. We already mentioned how John Franklin Myers will get involved there next to him inside. They've got Al Woods, who he's, you know, just across the board, they do a really good job of putting these more injury prone or older players in a spot where they don't have to play a lot of snaps and they can just be their best in the role that they're going to ask them to do. And that'll be Al Woods on first down. Like, I don't even know how many second downs Al Woods is going to play, but he could play the nose. He's a dominant 2 technique against the run. He's the ageless wonder. He's still going. He's like 36, 37 years old. And for what he is going to be asked to do as a run defending big body in the middle, he's probably going to be better than, honestly, anybody else they had last year to do that. So I almost like this approach a little bit, even if the overall players they lost with a guy like Sheldon Rankins on paper looks worse. But the way they're going to use these guys might end up giving them a better result. So Solomon Thomas is the other guy. You know, he's a splashy player. He's really effective for this scheme with all of these stunts. He's kind of the perfect guy for that because he can be the occupy man where he's just responsible for flying into the guard and the tackle so that someone else can loop around them. But he's got enough speed and bend to, you know, mix things up and be the looper as someone else is the blow-up man for these stunts. So he's really just a scheme-effective player, and defending the run from a 4-eye and a wide 9 technique, he can do it a little bit. Like, he's a decent enough player. He's carved out a solid career for himself after being a first-round bust for the Niners. And then Quentin Jefferson, likewise, kind of a very, like, he's nice to have. I don't know how much he's going to play, just because John Franklin Myers, I think, is above him in terms of that pass rushing interior edge hybrid type. Jefferson's very similar size, but, you know, Jefferson's a very good stuntman himself. He's got get off length. He's a gap shooting disruptor. So he's just more depth there. Tanzel Smart's fighting for a roster spot. He's got a lot to prove along with the rest of these guys. It is a thin interior defensive line. They don't even really have a true defensive tackle other than Quinnen Williams. I guess Al Woods is, but he's got the age and the durability questions. You got to keep Quinnen healthy. That'd be just a ridiculous sized loss if anything happened to him for this entire D-line. But as long as you have Quinnen, I think they can do a really good job rotating these guys. You know, one thing I would say about a line like this, just as a coaching point, run no huddle against this group, because they've constructed this in a way that, like, they're going to play these guys in the right downs. But if you're running no huddle against them, you can catch Will McDonald and Bryce Huff trying to defend the run, or you can catch Al Woods having to rush the passer, I'm surprised teams don't try that more against these teams that go with these D-line by committee approaches. But let's just hope nobody catches on to that. So ranking this group overall, 8th in pass rush, 12th in D-line run defense, overall coming out as the 10th overall defensive line. And you could make a case that that's even a few spots too low, in that their depth is more valuable than not having that necessarily alpha rusher. You hope Quinnen Williams maybe could be that guy, though. And if Quinnen Williams becomes an 80 pressure, 15 sack guy with the rest of these guys here, this really does have the upside to be a top 3 pass rush in the NFL. But a much shorter conversation with the linebacker room. Not a ton to really say here. I love the compliment of CJ Mosley to Quincy Williams and vice versa. Mosley is a complete vet at this point. He's one of the smartest linebackers in the league, a great leader of the defense that does a really good job making sure everybody's lined up. And for a scheme that is a little bit more complicated, it's great to have a guy like this that's going to make sure every gap is accounted for. He's a good run defender himself as well in terms of taking on blocks, finishing tackles. An underrated coverage player as well because of how heady he is. He's one of these guys that's really good at covering players, not grass. Even if it takes him an extra step and a half to get there, he just doesn't have the best speed. He's typically in the right place at the right time because he is so mentally ahead of it. So, I think he's underrated. He's a really good player. And then Quincy Williams next to him is like the opposite. He's a missile without a targeting system. And when you have the targeting system next to him in CJ Mosley, it works out. He's going to have poorly graded plays, Quincy Williams. He just is. He's going to miss some tackles because he takes bad angles. He's going to abandon his lane occasionally. He's going to get drowned out of the run occasionally because he is undersized. But God, he has some highlight plays that are a ton of fun. He's got the speed to man up running backs out of the backfield. He's a good blitzer. They like him a lot. He's Quinnen Williams' brother, so that's a fun dynamic. I really don't have any questions about this group. It's not a game-changing group or anything, but they do rank 13th overall for linebackers, 15th in run defense, 19th in coverage, but that overall balance between the two boosts them up. In terms of depth, the only guy there's a couple guys that I'm interested in, I guess, but Jamien Sherwood definitely has my attention. Has played well when given looks. He's a converted safety from Auburn, a 5th-round pick 2 years ago. Has received very good coaching here, just as it's benefited Quincy Williams, who was a 3rd-round pick for Jacksonville, who stunk initially. I'm very curious to see, could Jamien Sherwood eventually become a player here, or if one of these guys went down, what would he look like? Especially if Quincy Williams went down in that role, I think he could do it. Nick Vigil is probably the backup to CJ Mosley with all of his experience. He's played thousands of snaps in the league. He's never been a consistent player, but fine as a backup. Sam McGuavin made some good plays for those early Dolphins defenses with Brian Flores, where they were like, anybody that wants to try hard can play here, and Sam McGuavin earned some snaps as an undrafted guy. So it's adequate depth. They also have some prospects there. Zaire Barnes, good athlete out of Western Michigan, going to have to develop here. And then Chaz Surratt, who I always felt like the Vikings moved off of him a little bit too early. I've always liked his zone coverage IQ. He got the pick on his former teammate in Kellen Moore in that Hall of Fame game. Just needs to learn how to defend the run at a better level. He is not the most physically minded guy, a former quarterback, but I would like to see him make the team and see what he could get from Jeff Ulbricht's coaching, who's one of the best linebacker coaches in the league, if not the best. So there's your linebacker room. Very kind of average to solid group. And then you get to the secondary, and they actually come out as my number 1 secondary in the NFL. Now, it's not to say there aren't question marks here, but there's question marks included in every secondary. And right now, their only question is that number 2 safety spot that I think they have some decent answers for that we'll talk about. But I think this is clearly the best cornerback trio in the NFL, and I think you've got a pretty good case it's the best cornerback duo in the NFL as well. Sauce Gardner, Defensive Rookie of the Year. I mean, where do you want to start? Like, not only does the film do all the talking, but if you want to look at like stats, it's crazy. So if you sort all corners by whoever the corners that played at least 50% of the team snaps last year, it's a fair sample size to look at. Let's start with yards allowed. Sauce was 4th out of 72, which the 3 guys ahead of him played anywhere from 400 to 300 less snaps than him. So any corner that played 15 plus games, he was first in yards allowed, if you look at it that way. All right, QB rating, when targeted, he was 3rd out of 72. Completion percentage, so the percentage of targets that resulted in a completion, he was 2nd out of 72. Passes defended, he was tied for 1st. Tariq Woolen was tied for passes defended at 16. That to me is interceptions plus pass breakups. And then my personal favorite is yards per target, which factors in kind of the whole picture. Yards allowed, how often you're getting targeted, how effective you are on those targets. He was 2nd out of 80 on that metric. So, you know what, hell, let's use PFF coverage grade, which is imperfect. Number 1. Like, he was just insane. There's no reason to believe he can't continue. I don't know if he can get better because he was already the best corner in football, but was just so wildly impressed by Sauce. I knew he'd be good, but I did not think he'd be that level good. And he really does have Hall of Fame written all over him if he can stay healthy. Then you get to DJ Reed, who's one of the best CB2s in the NFL. He's perfect for this system. A lot of you guys that have followed this channel have heard me talk about these smaller corners really having success in quarters-heavy defenses. A lot of the DJ Reeds of the world, maybe 5 years ago, would have been written into the slot, basically, saying you're too small to play on the outside. But a lot of these smaller corners have come up having to really understand the game at a high level to play at a high level. And when you're playing a system that almost prioritizes IQ over all else in off zone, where you're reading route combinations and have to know your match rules and read the quarterback's eyes and know tendencies, DJ Reed has thrived there. But he's also like not physically limited for an outside corner. He can go bump and run man coverage. He's stocky enough to press you and get under your pads. He's fast enough to hang down the field. He's just been an underrated player for a couple years until he kind of broke out in Seattle, and then the Jets did a great job to identify his talent and put him in a spot where he could thrive as a CB2. And then you have a really good slot corner in Michael Carter. I don't want to go too far on his hype, but he's a really nice player. Again, a very smart player. He is a true slot guy. He's quick. He defends the run well. He's kind of the guy that teams look at and say, he's the guy we got to pick on. And, you know, he's not a perfect coverage player, so he's going to have some weeks where he gives up a few too many yards for your liking. But for the most part, he's pretty sticky in coverage, really smart in zone, and certainly I would say a relative strength as far as slot corners are concerned. So like I said, it doesn't get any better than those 3 as your corners, and that's obviously going to carry the weight in terms of them being the number 1 ranked secondary. But it's not a wide gap between them and the other top-ranked secondaries, because they have some questions at safety. Now, you'd rather have questions at safety than at corner. And I think there's a world where this group can turn into a pretty solid group pretty easily, but they just got to figure it out. You know, Jordan Whitehead is what he is. He's a good player. He is someone with slot corner experience who plays a lot of quarters. Where have you heard that before, fans of the channel? Yeah, he had a good transition going from a different role with the Bucs defense to this defense, which was a lot more quarters than he was used to running in Tampa, and it definitely fit him well. I think year 2 of this system, he should only be maybe even a little bit better, being more comfortable back there. He's a really incredibly physical run defender coming downhill, so he's good for quarters because you do need these guys to fill against the run. Really nice fit, really good player. Not a lockdown coverage player by any stretch of the imagination, but he's definitely not the question mark that we're talking about with the safety group. That's going to be really the competition at this point between Tony Adams and Adrian Amos. And, when I first got ready to do this Jets deep dive, I just assumed Adrian Amos was going to be their starter. But right now, Tony Adams is listed as the starter, and I'm intrigued. I'm very intrigued that he might be a diamond in the rough player. He had a solid season last year as an undrafted free agent, made the team, ended up playing 200 snaps, and actually was good in those games. Ended up really starting the last 2 games of the season. Now, unfortunately for me, I didn't watch those 2 games, so I can't speak, and I didn't have Tony Adams on my radar as a draft prospect, so I've actually never really watched all 22 on Tony Adams to provide deep analysis on him. I'll just give you full disclosure on that front. But I'm definitely intrigued. I mean, the physical profile is good. This guy played cornerback for the most part at Illinois, sometimes in the slot. But again, fans of the channel, when have you heard me say a slot corner is a good piece to move to a hybrid quarters-heavy system? It tends to work out more often than not. But when you look at it, you're like, why did this guy go undrafted? He measured in at 5'11", 200 pounds. He's got some size to him, ran a 4.47, under a 7.3 cone drill, 4.06 20-yard shuttle, 130-inch broad jump, 41.5-inch vertical jump, 14 bench press reps. You go back to his Illinois profile, played over 2,000 snaps for a good Illinois defense, a good year in 2021, his last year, broke up 5 passes, picked off a ball. Like, I don't know why this guy wasn't on my radar, but probably should have been. And what a find that could be for Joe Douglas if they found a solid starting safety back there. Again, very wait and see. There's a world where he's just not a very good player, but he hasn't shown to be a bad football player in 5 years, and he's a great athlete. So very well might just be a diamond in the rough. And the fact that he's fending off Adrian Amos right now is only more signs of positivity there. So I'm very intrigued, excited to actually get to watch some All-22 on him if he's starting. And I'm definitely going to give Robert Saleh and this group the benefit of the doubt to figure that out. And then they sign Adrian Amos, and he had that kind of classic 30-year-old drop-off season for a defensive back that feels less and less common these days, but it hit Adrian Amos hard. He looked like he struggled to move on the back end. The range was non-existent. His hips looked remarkably tight. I'd be worried about him playing anything other than like a true box safety role at this point, where he's still good in run support. But I can definitely see how they look at him in coverage compared to Tony Adams, who's young and athletic, and say, you know what? Our ceiling is way higher with Tony Adams back there. Let's see if he can play first before we just hand the job to Amos. So maybe if he did play, Amos would be somewhere between where he was in 2021, where he was still a good player, and 2022, where he was literally a liability in coverage for the Packers secondary. But there's no guarantee that he's still a good player. He was sitting there available on the free agent block kind of for a reason. So definitely to be determined with that safety group. They do have Ashton Davis still. He was a 3rd-round pick with a lot of tools. You know, I'm not going to sit here and pound the table for Ashton Davis, but I'm still intrigued. Dane Cruikshank, decent enough, like 4th safety to have, special teamer, competitive depth. Trey Dean is an interesting undrafted pickup as well. Reiterate the points about slot corners, playing a lot of quarters. Trey Dean played a lot of corner at Florida. Didn't love his tape, though, I'll be honest. Wasn't surprised he went undrafted. So that's kind of your safety room. Either way, it's difficult for a safety group to truly hold a secondary back, especially when the corners are this good. And it helps that they at least have one good player. They just have to figure out the other spot. If that was your argument for why the Jets shouldn't be the number 1 secondary in the NFL, I guess I'm not going to fight you on it too much, but it's not quite enough to remove them from the best secondary in the NFL for me. As far as the cornerback depth is concerned, we didn't talk about that. It's a very thin group, other than you do have Bryce Hall. So you can run one deep and be just fine, especially because DJ Reed can step into the slot. So you're pretty flexible to sustain one injury there. Bryce Hall is a good, lengthy player, just lacks some long speed there. But he's kind of known at this point as the best CB4 in the NFL, someone that fans of other teams have said, hey, we should throw a day 3 pick for Bryce Hall and see what he can do as a starter, because he's he was a good starter, or at least a solid starter for them before they upgraded with Sauce. Then beyond that, you got some journeyman veterans, Craig James, Justin Hardy, Jimmy Moreland. Jimmy Moreland, I'm intrigued by, very reminiscent to me of some of these undersized slot corners that didn't get the opportunity to thrive as outside corners. Guys like DJ Reed here, but maybe on a smaller scale. Guys like Duke Shelley for the Vikings last year, Danny Johnson for the Commanders last year. I would be intrigued at least if Jimmy Moreland could fill in for DJ Reed as an outside corner. I liked his tape coming out of James Madison there, or at least what I saw in his highlight reel. I'm not going to lie, I didn't have all 22 on that one, but he did intrigue me. But then they also spent a 6th round pick, I think, on Jarek Bernard Converse, right? I just listed it as JBC because I didn't have room for it. Yeah, Jarek Bernard Converse. Not a good corner, but an athletic corner out of the SEC. I'll just leave it at that. They're gambling on traits that different coaching could get something out of him. He's also on the pup, so it might be a good idea to just stash him on IR for a year and see what he's got in year 2. But yeah, obviously a great secondary. They're great in run support too. They're in my second tier for DB run support, so that only helps. But let's wrap up the defense. They come out exactly where they finished last year for me, 5th in defensive DVOA last year. They rank as my 5th defense coming into the year. I think there's potential, though, for this to be the best defense in the NFL. They have still some players on the upswing. Guys like Quinnen Williams could prove to be an elite player. Some of these younger pass rushers could take a next step up. If that safety room figures itself out, too, this really could be the best defense in the NFL. But right now, 4th in pass defense, 6th in run defense. That is going to be just fine for them to be one of the best units in the NFL. It's a very balanced team. They're good on special teams as well. They got Greg Zuerlein at kicker. I like what Mecole Hardman's going to be able to do as a return man for them if they want to hand the keys there to him. So that's not a question mark. Really, as you look at their strengths and weaknesses overall, not a ton of weaknesses or questions at all. It's the offensive coaching and the offensive tackle health. That's really what it comes down to. Those are my only questions for this Jets team. I guess you could lump safety number 2 into that, would be fair, but I'm just not that worried about it. I think worst case, Amos can be just fine. But this team's got some pretty major strengths too. Quarterback, obvious strength. Defensive line, huge strength. Secondary, massive strength. Those are heavy-hitting value positions. Elevating this team to potential greatness. And then defensive coaching as well has been really impressive here under Robert Saleh for the last 12 games or so. But let's take a look at the schedule. Obviously, this team has a ridiculous schedule, especially to start the season. And I don't want to hear any I told you so's about Aaron Rodgers or the Jets if this team starts 2-4. Because they got to open against Buffalo on Monday night. They got to go to Dallas, who I haven't ranked yet. They got to host New England. That's not going to be a gimme, though I think they will be pretty big favorites. Then they got Kansas City, Super Bowl champs. They got to go to Denver in what's going to be one of the more anticipated matchups of the week for sure, with Sean Payton's comments about Nathaniel Hackett. And then, the other team that went to the Super Bowl, Philadelphia, coming to town. Just to walk out of that 3-3, you'd feel pretty damn good about this Jets team, but that's definitely not a given. You do get the bye week after that. The NFL... some favors there for the Jets after that run. Things do loosen up a little bit, but not a ton. I mean, at the Giants, not going to be easy. Subway Series. And then the Chargers, Justin Herbert coming to town. I mean, gosh, that's another really tough game. But the second half of the year, I do see 4 quote-unquote gimmies. They have to finish those gimmies and get those wins. But at the Raiders, is Jimmy Garoppolo even going to be healthy at that point? You got the Falcons coming to town. The Texans coming to town, the Washington coming to town, should be able to win those. Still got 3 more tough division games, though, in that stretch. You've got at Cleveland as well, so it's still not easy in the second half, but better than the first half. There's not a lot of analysis needed there. It's a gauntlet. This team's going to have to live up to their own hype and be the potential world beater that they can be. I think it's possible. I really like this team. I think they do at least get to 10 wins and get into the playoffs. So I do like the over. My calculations had them coming out at 10-point wins, so 10.1. So I would take that. But in terms of like, can this team win the Super Bowl? I definitely think they can. Like, I think 13-1 is a good price. But if you like this team and you want to make that bet, I say absolutely go for it. Like, I really think Aaron Rodgers has a chip on his shoulder this year. I think this team has incredible talent. It just does kind of feel like when Tom Brady went to Tampa and there was a really good team in place and everything settled in the second half of the year. And I think that could be very, very similar here with the Jets. But it's definitely not a guarantee, and the conference is much harder than what Tom Brady had to get through at the time. So obviously a different challenge here for Rodgers and the Jets. But I really hope you guys have enjoyed this deep dive. That's all we've got. Again, please do hit that like button down below if you haven't yet. I really do appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe if you enjoy. Let me know in the comments as well what you think. Who do you think is next coming in with that number 6 spot? Should be out within a couple days. We really got to go basically every other day if we're going to get this series done until the season starts. God bless my sleep schedule, and God bless my wife for dealing with me as we get through this. But thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you for the next one. Peace out.